Good morning, everyone. Today, it's my pleasure to speak with Father David Hollenbach. And Father Hollenbach is the Pedro Arrupe Distinguished Research Professor in our School of Foreign Service and a Senior Fellow in our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and is also connected to our Theology Department. So David, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And let's jump right in. For a number of years, you've been working on and writing about humanitarian issues, sharing your experiences with many different Catholic and Jesuit organizations, and working in places from Kenya to Vietnam to the Philippines to right here in the United States. You've also led two different professional societies focused on Catholic theology and Christian ethics. Can you talk about the journey that brought you here to Georgetown?
Well, thank you very much for including me in this conversation, Jack. It's a pleasure to be with you. My journey has been one of, as a young Jesuit, getting very involved in the discussion of human rights, going back to the days when Jimmy Carter was president, who initiated a major human rights initiative in U.S. foreign policy. And I got very involved in writing about those issues. And then through various connections, I got invited to go to a number of different places. Probably the most influential was invited to teach at our Jesuit School of Theology in Nairobi, Kenya, Hekima University College. And while I was there, I got connected with the work of Jesuit Refugee Service in East Africa, which covers a lot of territory and has a lot of refugees in the area. And I had the opportunity to spend some time in a couple of the refugee settings there. So it moved me in that direction. And that's the way in which, since then, my human rights work has been heavily focused on people displaced by war and refugees and people of that sort. And that kind of brought me to Georgetown, where there's a lot going on in that area. And at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the opportunity to pursue this issue with a focus on the role of religion, and especially my own Catholicism and Jesuit commitment to deal with those issues. So that's kind of how I got here to Georgetown.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Now, one resource is Catholic social teaching, and you have developed some deep insights from an academic perspective and from a spiritual perspective into Catholic social thought. How might someone looking to learn more begin to think about these ideas? What are some of the ideas that you've been most focused on when you think about a commitment to human rights from the perspective of Catholic social thought or Christian ethics?
Well, one of the most important components of the notion of human rights is that they are genuinely universal standards that touch all human beings. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is about the rights of all people. And the Christian tradition is very strong, going all the way back to the first book of the Bible, to the book of Genesis, in saying that all people are created in the image and likeness of God and possess an intrinsic dignity that requires respect. And so the universality of the Christian vision of humanity fits very directly with the universality of notions of human rights. And so there are deep theological and religious reasons for this. There are also very important reasons in terms of the role of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church is a major transnational agency. You might even say the Roman Catholic Church is the largest multinational corporation in the world. It reaches across borders. And the Catholic identity of people, as the Christian identity of people, has to be transnational. And it fits then very nicely with the universality of the notion of human rights. And in addition, if you go back to the Jesuit tradition, one of the things that Ignatius Loyola was very strong in stressing was that we should always be pursuing what he called the more universal good. The common good, not only of our own country, but the common good of all of people. And so the universality fits in with the Jesuit idea. So these three ideas, it seems to me, nicely mesh with each other. and are worth pursuing in terms of the question you asked me.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Now, you've written a number of books on the refugee crisis, and you've written extensively on human rights and ethics. Can you talk about what you see at stake in this moment?
Well, I mean, the situation we face right now regarding the refugee and forced migration picture is really gravely serious. We have just under 80 million forcibly displaced people in the world today. It's the largest number of refugees and other displaced people ever recorded in human history. 80 million forced migrants or refugees and internally displaced people is 1% of the total human population. Just think of 1 out of every 100 people on Earth has been forced and driven from their home as refugees or internally displaced people. This is a grave crisis facing us right now. And that's why I called my recent book about the refugee issue, Humanity in Crisis. The 80 million people are the people facing this crisis. But there's another dimension to that notion of humanity in crisis, namely our common humanity, the fact that we are in fact brothers and sisters with each other with a mutual responsibility is being resisted and indeed rejected in many parts of the world today. The idea of building walls or of setting the Coast Guard out into the Mediterranean to prevent refugees from reaching Europe from Africa, or boundaries between other parts of the world and another, the humanity that we share together is being resisted, or with the commonality is being resisted by a number of people in many parts of the world today. Now, it's due to the fact, of course, that people feel vulnerable when they see refugees or other migrants coming, and therefore they tend to resist. But I think that it's a mistake to see this as a threat. In fact, we know that the United States has been thriving because of its migration history. We regard ourselves as a nation of immigrants. And the facts are, if you look carefully, refugees arriving in the United States actually pay more, they pay more in taxes than they take out of the government and social services. That the refugees who arrive here are contributors to our society just on the level of financial contributions by taxes they pay compared to what they take out in But in addition, they enrich our culture and so forth. So I think one of the tasks that we face today is finding ways to help people see that they should not be afraid of bringing people together. I always love Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, when the large number of refugees from Syria were coming into Germany. She turned to the people of Germany and she said in German, "Wir schaffen das." We can handle this. We can hack it, so to speak. And they did. If the United States, Germany, and other European countries have many fewer refugees per capita than most of the poor countries of the world today. Most of the refugees in the world today have been hosted by very poor countries. Uganda, for example, has over 1 million South Sudanese refugees in a relatively small but very poor population. In Lebanon, 1 out of every 6 people inside the borders of Lebanon is a refugee. And 1 out of every 4 if you count the Palestinians who've been there for several generations. So we're not faced with a crisis the way some of the other parts of the world are, and we should be responding in a way we have the capacity to respond. As Angela Merkel said, we can handle this, and we can welcome more people than we are.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, this semester, you're teaching a course on religion, ethics, and international affairs. Can you talk about some of your experiences this fall and how you've been able to bring in some international voices into your classroom?
Well, since we're in the midst of this COVID crisis, we've moved to online teaching or virtual teaching, and almost all of our teaching is done online. And we were encouraged to say, how can you take advantage of the fact that you're doing a lot of teaching electronically. And I have had a good bit of experience of working with Jesuits in other parts of the world. And I thought to myself, how could I take advantage of that to capitalize on the fact that the Jesuit network is genuinely a global network? So I made some arrangements to get several of my Jesuit colleagues in other parts of the world to participate in my courses. For example, we were doing in this course you mentioned on ethics, religion, and international affairs, when we started in on a unit about human rights, I used the Rwanda genocide, which took place back in 1994, where in the course of just 3 months, about 800,000 people were killed. It was a truly horrendous action. And I thought we were dealing with this as a massive violation of human rights. And I have a couple of former colleagues or former students of mine, both of whom are Jesuits, who are from Rwanda, who are survivors of the genocide. So I set up a way to have them participate with my students in dialogue about what it was like to go through the Rwanda genocide, what it meant. Both of these Jesuits, friends of mine, colleagues of mine, lost virtually their whole extended families. One of them lost both his parents, another lost most of his siblings. They went through hell, in a very literal sense of the word, I guess you could say. And I had them come and talk to the class. We recorded a session where they gave an overview of what happened, and then we had an hour-long dialogue with them. They were in Rwanda, and my students are scattered around the world, a lot of them in Washington, but some of them in various other parts of the world. And we were able to talk about what it was like to go through the reality of the Rwanda genocide and what could have been done to prevent it. And one of them, I directed his doctoral thesis on the human rights failures in face of the Rwanda genocide. And then the other one talked a lot about how do you sustain hope after you've been through something like that. And the students these days need hope, I think, and he really inspired them. And so that was one component. Another component was on the refugee issue. I had another segment of the course. We were doing all this in light of ethical and theological ideas. It's not a social science course, it's an ethics and religion course. But I also had a section on refugees. And a fellow who I know pretty well, he's an American Jesuit, but he's working in the Kakuma refugee camp in Northwest Kenya, working with the refugees there. His name is William O'Neill. He's been a visiting professor at Georgetown back a few years back. And we set up an arrangement where he did the same thing that my Rwandan friends did. We had him record a session and showed it to the students, and then we went live with him for another hour dialogue about what it was like to be working in the refugee camp in Kakuma. In Kakuma refugee camp, there are almost 200,000 refugees right now. It's one of the two gigantic refugee camps in Kenya, where there's Somali refugees, there's South Sudanese refugees, the refugees from Democratic Republic of Congo. Anyway, we had all of these. We had Bill O'Neill talking with the students back and forth, and he gave them a live experience of what it's like to do this. We were going to do it with refugees participating, but because of the requirements in the camp, they were not allowed to do that. They don't want, you have to get all kinds of approval to do anything online with refugees. So we just did it with my colleague, Bill O'Neill, but he talked about the experience of the people he was working with. And the students, I think, were very moved by that too. So we tried to take advantage of the online dimension of teaching this semester to broaden the experience of the students so that they weren't just talking to David Hollenbach, who's sitting in a room in Georgetown. They were also talking to several people in very important locations around the world directly related to what we were trying to do in the course. So that was an innovative kind of thing. I've always thought, using the electronic means for teaching could be good, and we've been forced to do it. So I'm trying to learn what to do while we're forced to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. At the early part of October, Pope Francis issued his most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, and it's a document that reflects his deep commitment to interreligious dialogue and Christian-Muslim relations. Now, you've recently written about Fratelli Tutti. Could you share a few of the ideas that you think are most important as we reflect on the significance of this new encyclical?
Well, the new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, the title is Italian. It's taken from Francis of Assisi, who is the man whom Pope Francis took the name of Francis because he has deep devotion to Francis of Assisi. But it means literally brothers and sisters all. We're all brothers and sisters with each other. And what the Pope is trying to do in this encyclical is to stimulate that notion of universal solidarity, fraternity, he calls it. We could also say sorority, brothers and sisters together across borders. And he brings a whole series of issues to the fore as needing to be addressed by that kind of transnational global solidarity, the refugee issue, the reality of poverty, the reality of the environmental and climate change questions, the whole agenda of human rights, all of these things. And Pope Francis, I think, is capitalizing on both the deep religious traditions in the Christian faith about our universal brotherhood and sisterhood, but also capitalizing on the church's worldwide extent as a transnational body that I mentioned before. Now, in terms of the interreligious component of this, I find it very interesting that the encyclical begins at the very beginning with Pope Francis saying that he has been inspired to write this document through his interactions with the Grand Imam of the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, Ahmad al-Taib. And then he goes further and he quotes him 5 times in the encyclical, and he ends the document, the encyclical, with long excerpts from a document that he and the Grand Imam prepared together back earlier this year, a document entitled On Human Fraternity. Now, this is quite an extraordinary development. The fact that the Pope is saying that a major papal encyclical has been inspired by his discussions with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. Now, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar is probably the highest ranking authority in the Sunni Muslim tradition. They don't have anything quite like a pope, but the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, if there's a leading voice in Sunni Islam, it's him. And so for the Pope to be doing this together with the Grand Imam, or at least acknowledging his indebtedness to the Grand Imam, is a sign, I think, of genuine breakthrough on the level of interreligious collaboration. He also cites later in the document, an event that took place in the life of Francis of Assisi, when Francis of Assisi met with the Sultan of the Muslims in Cairo back in the 12th century. And so this is another example of interreligious exchange, which I think was very rich. So this document is not just talking the talk about universal collaboration and solidarity. Pope Francis is walking the walk. He's doing it with people like the Grand Imam. So that's a very interesting breakthrough, it seems to me.
We'll provide a link for our community to your essay. And
thank you.
And David, I just can't thank you enough for taking this time to be with us today.
Do it.
In closing, is there a message you'd like to leave with the members of our community?
Well, I would just say that we're all being forced to recognize our human interdependence by the COVID crisis that we're facing. And as we recognize our interdependence, we also can recognize the possibility that we can grow in our mutual solidarity with each other and our mutual care for each other. And I hope that that's one of the things we'll take away from this crisis, is the recognition of our mutual support for each other as a real possibility, not only in our own country, but in our world.
Thank you. Thank you. And David, thank you for your time and for your leadership. Your perspectives have been so valuable to all of us as we've sought to understand our faith and our responsibilities in this global community. So thank you. And I look forward to being with all of you again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.